Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our February 3rd Thursday. I am Sarah Renee Beach, the program director here at Writers League of Texas. Tonight, our topic is Places Unknown, Crafting Fully Realized Settings. We're joined tonight by three brilliant authors whose books have really unique and compelling approaches to this topic. So I think we're in store for a really rich discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we'll get into the discussion. So our first panelist tonight is Cristina Garcia. Cristina Garcia is the author of 8 novels: Dreaming and Cuban, The Agüero Sisters, Monkey Hunting, A Handbook to Luck, The Lady Matador's Hotel, King of Cuba, Here in Berlin, and Vanishing Maps. Additional publications include 2 Latinx anthologies, Cubanísimo, the vintage book of contemporary Cuban literature, and Bordering Fires, the vintage book of contemporary Mexican and Chicano literature. Books for young readers, The Dog Who Loved the Moon, I Wanna Be Your Shoebox, and Dreams of Significant Girls, and a collection of poetry, The Lesser Tragedy of Death. Garcia's work has been nominated for a National Book Award and translated into 15 languages. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Writers Award, a Hodder Fellowship at Princeton University, and an NEA grant, among others. Garcia has taught at universities nationwide, and recently she was a visiting professor at University of San Francisco. Cristina, we are so lucky to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And our next panelist is Ursula Pike. Ursula Pike is a graduate of the MFA program in creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts and is the author of An Indian Among Los Indígenas, a native travel memoir from Heyday Books. Her work has been included in the collections Know We Are Here, Voices of Native California Resistance, and A Fire to Light Our Tongues, Texas Writers on Spirituality. Her writing won the 2019 Writers League of Texas Manuscript Contest in the memoir category and has appeared in LitHub, Yellow Medicine Review, World Literature Today, and Legia magazine. Ms. Pike has an MA in economics from Western Illinois University. She served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Bolivia. Ursula is an enrolled member of the Karuk tribe and grew up in California and Oregon. Ursula, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We're so lucky to have you.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited about this discussion.
And then our last but certainly not least panelist is John Pipkin. John Pipkin is the director of the undergraduate creative writing program here at UT Austin, where he has won several teaching awards. Originally from Baltimore, he received a PhD in English from Rice University. His first novel, Woods Burner, won the New York Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, the Massachusetts Center for the Book Novel Prize, and the Texas Institute of Letters Stephen Turner Prize. His second novel, The Blind Astronomer's Daughter, was named Book of the Month by the London Times. John has received fellowships from MacDowell, Yaddo, Dobie Paisano, and the Harry Ransom Center. Thank you so much for being here with us, John.
Oh, sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so now that we've got all of that out of the way, I'm so excited to dig into this topic with you all. I'd like to set the scene, pun intended, by talking with each of you about a specific book of yours, and then we'll move into a more general discussion on the craft topic of setting. So Cristina, your book, Vanishing Maps, explores the diaspora of one Cuban family by introducing us to 4 generations spread across 4 different countries. There's Cuba, the US, Russia, and Germany. And then there's a little bit of Spain in there too. And through each family member, we get to see the push and pull of history and family and identity as their lives play out over the course of a year. It's a beautifully and hauntingly told story about the refraction of homeland. It's both elegiac and hopeful all at once, really beautifully told. And So my first question is, can you tell us about the expansiveness of your book setting, how you decided to write about so many different places, and what were the joys and challenges that were involved in embarking on this really epic journey?
Well, thanks for that question and comments. I think for me, it's really a book about diaspora. So it's as much about dislocation and navigating new places, as it is about a sort of geographic home. I think all the characters, in one way or another, are struggling to belong, not just to each other, but to the places where they've landed. Probably, it's a multi-voiced narrative, but at the center of it all, the sort of the cynosure of this galaxy is a young Cuban man who's a translator in Berlin. He's fluent in 4 languages. He's also a drag queen, and he ends up almost centrifugally attracting this globally strewn cousins from everywhere who end up in Berlin with him. So Berlin becomes kind of the center of the book, where everyone ends up. And I think for me, it was not that unusual, being a Cuban American, that your family is spread across the world in one way or another. Yeah, many of them end up in Miami, not me, but they do. But there's also, someone told me recently about being in Egypt, and the person that they rented their camel ride from was Cuban. I'm like, Cubano? And what was he doing there? So, and also the big convulsive changes that happened in the Cold War, where Cubans went to study in the then called Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And so this is the fallout from all of that. Cuba was also involved in wars of liberation in Africa. So there's this whole Angolan section in a previous book called Here in Berlin. So revolution begets dislocation, begets kind of interesting stories that traverse the globe for me. Anyway.
Yeah, and how did you choose the countries and the places and the cities that you did settle on? How did you choose those particular locations?
Well, they made a kind of sense to me. Prior to Vanishing Maps, I did a book called Here in Berlin. And so I had spent a few months there researching that book. And so it seemed a very obvious place for someone who got caught up in the fallout from the Soviet Union in 1990-91, that he might end up in Berlin. And so he left St. Petersburg, took a long train ride to Berlin, and then set up shop over there. But it's not all that strange, because in Cuba in the 60s and 70s, a lot of students learned Russian as their second language, not English, not French, not other languages, but Russian. And so again, as I was saying earlier, these are all particularities to the political upheavals and fallout of revolution and politics and all its attendants and all its attendant disruptions of family life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What you asked me, like, why specifically? Well, Berlin, because it was definitely a big connecting piece to the Cuban diaspora. There's also Miami is there, Los Angeles is there. These are cities where there are a lot of Cubans, especially Miami. There are a couple of Cubans, one who grew up in Moscow and one who grew up in Czechoslovakia. Again, I had an uncle who studied in Moscow, who got his PhD in Prague. So it seems kind of crazy, but it's not. These are the trajectories of actual people's lives, and there are very few people who grew up in Cuba or in the Cuban exile who don't at least speak a third language for one reason or another besides English and Spanish.
Mm. We'll definitely come back to that. Thank you. And so, John, let's move to your book, Woods Burner. It takes us back in time to 1844 New England and in around Concord, Massachusetts. The inciting incident of the novel is a forest fire accidentally started by none other than the canonical nature enthusiast Henry David Thoreau. And as the fire is kind of raging on, we're introduced to an ensemble cast of characters whose lives intersect and are deeply impacted by this fire. It kind of sets them on different trajectories than the one that they were on. It's an evocative story that's both rich in detail and propulsive, which I think is a hard balance to master. And so can you tell us more about setting your book in a time, in a real time and place in history, and how you both expand upon that to, give yourself creative license to fictionalize, and where you depart from what really happened.
Yeah, thanks for that summary. That was really good. I think one of the biggest challenges about writing historical fiction is not so much gathering the historical facts, but trying to forget what you think you know. So especially, for example, talking about a canonical figure like Henry David Thoreau, he was not Henry David Thoreau yet at that point in his life, right? That's what made him an attractive character, is that we know as readers who he's going to become and what he's going on to do. But at the point in his life when he sets this fire, he hadn't really published anything yet. He had published maybe a couple of poems, a couple of essays, but they were only published in the Dial, which was the Transcendentalist magazine that Margaret Fuller was editing, and that had just gone out of business. So he really didn't have any place to publish his work. No one was interested in what he was writing. He had taken a trip on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers with his brother John, which that is what becomes his first book. But his brother John had recently died of lockjaw, so that he was kind of in a depression over that, and he had kind of given up on the whole idea of wanting to become a writer. He was starting to sign his letters Henry David Thoreau, civil engineer. Like that's what he thought he was going to be, was a map maker and sort of a bridge builder, and that was going to be his life. So I kind of had to put aside everything that I knew about him or that I thought I knew about him, and to try to treat him as a person who, like any of us, really has no idea what's coming next, what's in his future. And that same approach really applied to that whole time period and the whole setting of the novel, that this is taking place in 1844, which is, not too long after Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing essays about how Americans needed to find their own literature, their own philosophy. We needed to begin developing our own culture and stop looking to European models. But we also know as readers that we're only about 15 years away from the Civil War, and there's already rumblings about that. The abolitionist movement is really just getting started. We as readers are aware of the tensions of the time. So that was, I think, a difficult topography to navigate, where, I wanted on the one hand to create this sense of a period in time when everything is about to explode, where we're about to see, North and South fighting. We're about to see America sort of emerge with its own culture and its own literature, Walt Whitman, and all of the rest that's going to come along, but that hasn't quite happened yet. So that was the real challenge, was how to paint a landscape where we can see the potential for what's about to occur, but we're not quite there yet, and the characters aren't quite aware of that, because that's always one of the dangers of writing historical fiction, is you don't want your characters walking around going, I'm living in history, and kind of noticing historical things and doing historical things. They just need to be living their lives, and they're just living a life in which the setting is quite different from ours. So I always try to use that as my touchstone. Are these people living lives just as ordinary people trying to get through their day? And something that sort of struck me when the book had first come out and a number of readers had sent me some very nice compliments about how they felt I had recreated the town of Concord and what was going on, what the town looked like and what it felt like to be there. And I thought I really didn't include that much detail about the town of Concord, and that was because I could look at photographs of contemporary Concord, or I could read details about what kind of businesses were there, but I don't really know exactly what Concord in 1844 looked like or what it felt like to be there. So I tried to be very sparing in the details that I put on the page, so that it really left it to readers to fill in some of those blanks. And so there were some details about someone driving an ox cart through muddy streets, and some stores that had some wooden signs hanging outside. And there were just enough details like that you got the feel for the time and the place, but I wasn't really trying to recreate in specific detail what the particular setting was. And that, I think, made it possible for readers to really engage with that, and to fill in those blanks where there weren't details for them. And one other thing that was really just a happy accident of research is I was teaching in London on a semester program when I was doing some edits on the novel. And I was working in the British Library, and I was wondering if they had any information about Concord, Massachusetts in the 1840s, because they have everything. And there was actually a book where it was called something like A Scrapbook of Concord, New England in 1844, or
Wow.
in the 1840s. And somebody had sat down in the 1840s and like cut out newspaper advertisements and articles and pasted them into this old, like, what would have been well, it wasn't a photo album, but it's sort of old kind of album. And that was in the library with no explanation of what there was. But I found things like bookstores, their advertisements, and they were advertising things like games and puzzles and stationery and all the things that we see in the bookstore now that aren't really books. And so there were a number of things like that where it was just really a great accidental find to be able to drop in specific little details of what kinds of things you might find in a shop window in Concord in the 1840s.
Oh, what a find. Wow.
Yeah.
We'll get back to research, so let's definitely put a pin in that. Um, and I do want to talk about where you are very richly detailed is the woods and the
Mhm.
fire. So we'll come back to that. But Ursula, I want to talk to you about your beautiful memoir. It takes us, an Indian among Los Indigenas, takes us along with you to Bolivia for your 2-year Peace Corps service assignment. We get to experience all of the highs and lows of this experience with you, and really get to see this country through your unique perspective as an Indigenous person from the US who's hoping to help Indigenous Bolivians specifically. It's deeply vulnerable and honest, and it interrogates, like really masterfully interrogates, the very notion of service and development under colonialism. It was really a wonderful, wonderful, well done, incisive memoir. And I'd love it if you could tell us about what it's like to write about a real place that exists in the world without the ability to, fictionalize. And yeah, I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear about the challenges and joys of that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for all you said about the book. Well, for me, one of the challenges was, even though while I was there, I kept extensive journals. I wrote almost every day. I didn't necessarily write about what I was seeing. I mean, visually, the landscape. I wrote some of that. And so going back afterwards and trying to think about what did these spaces look like to me, required me to do some research, but also just to kind of get in that space to look at my pictures and different things, to take myself mentally back to those moments, being in that place and seeing what it looked like, what the streets looked like, and what the mountains looked like. And also, it was really important to me to think about how have people seen Bolivia, or how do people think about Bolivia? Because honestly, people don't really think about Bolivia too much, if they think about it at all, or maybe they think about a llama and an indigenous woman. And I wanted to go deeper than that and show folks interacting with their environment and me interacting with them, and just the resilience of the people that I was working with, because it is a harsh landscape. It's in the Andes. There's really a lack of water, and just to show them thriving in that environment was important to me.
And I think you did that very well. I know at one point, or you did, not at one point, you made the decision to change the name of the village that you worked in, as well as the people you interacted with. Can you tell us a little bit about when you made that decision in the writing process?
Right. Yeah. Well, I teach creative writing at Austin Community College. I teach a memoir class, and that is one of the very first questions that all the students ask about the dangers of writing about real life, real people, and they worry about that. And it is something to be mindful of, and it's something that, as I was working in my MFA program, I talked to some of the other students about how I'm okay with all of my story coming out, and everything that happened to me, or the choices that I made. I have no problem with that, but that's a choice I'm making for myself. The people who I was writing about, it's not they're not making that choice. And so one of my fellow students suggested, well, why don't you change the name of the town? And I had never thought about that. It seemed so obvious, but so I decided to change it, and I changed it to Cantuta, which is the national flower of Bolivia. And I felt that kind of gave it a wider, it made it more than just the little town. It made the town represent more than just that little space in Bolivia.
Yeah. And yeah, not sacrificing the detail of the real place and the essence of the real place, but protecting and protecting these people's identity. And yeah. And I like the idea that changing the name to that makes it more encapsulates more of Bolivia than the one place.
Yeah, I hope it did.
Mm-hmm. And so the next thing I'd like to talk about is how your relationship to your book's settings maybe changed as you wrote your book. I know, John, you kind of talked about how you had to forget what you knew as you kind of thought more about Concord and researched Concord. Was there anything that surprised you, or anything that changed about your relationship to this place as you developed a narrative there?
Yeah, I was really surprised to find out just the basic historical fact that there are actually more trees in Concord now than there were at the time of Henry David Thoreau. That actually the whole area, in fact, around Walden Pond is much more densely wooded today than it was then. And so when I set out, I thought that I was going to be writing kind of a an ode to an untouched natural world that has been lost, and something like that. And actually, it was the case that there was already sort of increasing deforestation in the area, which was one of the things that was driving Ralph Waldo Emerson to think that he wanted to do this. He had this outrageous plan that he wanted to buy a piece of land just to save it from the woodsman's axe. Because back then, land and trees, well, and today as well, we're simply thought of as resources. Like this is wealth. This is here. Those trees are here to be cut down. And why would you buy a piece of land to just preserve it? And so there were people were beginning to have this experience of going out for walks in the woods, or going to Walden Pond, and places where they thought there had been, or where there had been trees before, they'd come back and there were no trees. And because they'd been cut down by whoever owned the land. And that was actually a problem that Thoreau encountered when he was trying to find people to help him put out the fire that he started. They would look at the fire and say, well, that's on his property. That's not my property. Even though, like, the fire was going to blow through all of the property and eventually potentially hit Concord. So kind of getting that understanding of, if you think of environmentalism and you think of the environmentalist movement, which really sort of gets started at this point, but comes more full bore into sort of the mid 20th century, they were already sort of recognizing the fact that people could have a profound impact on the landscape. And the reason why that it is so densely wooded now is there was a focused effort in the early 20th century to reforest the area. So I tried to spend more time on the setting description, sort of emphasizing the fragility of the world and how people needed to be careful. And in fact, the one newspaper article that reported on this event at the time said something to the effect of, we hope that this event, this fire, stands as an example to people to be careful when they go into the woods for recreation. Because he was on a fishing trip when he accidentally started this fire. So that discourse was already in place. And that was really something that I wasn't anticipating. Like I say, I thought I was going to be writing a story that was set in a kind of untouched natural world. But those worries and concerns were already present. And so that caused me to try to describe things in a slightly different way. Again, how fragile the world was, how easily it could be harmed or could be damaged, and how much it was in need of protection.
Yeah, I was surprised when I read that in your author's note, and it's interesting to hear how that changed the way you wrote about the place. That's so interesting.
Yeah, because that event was also what I can't avoid using the word sparked, but it was also what kind of sparked the need to try for that early environmentalist movement. And that's when Henry David Thoreau decided to go off and live at Walden Pond, finally, which he had been talking about but hadn't done yet. This was the event that really sort of pushed him to go do that.
That's so interesting. Christina, what about you? What you talked a little bit about your relationship to the various settings in your novel. As you researched these settings or unfolded your narrative in these different places, did your relationship to them shift at all?
Well, I'll focus on Berlin specifically because I think the city has played such a huge role in my last two novels. So it's a place I find fascinating. And it feels like the time frame of the book is the year 2000, not only because of the millennium, but also it's 10 years or a little bit more since the fall of the wall, and all the rules and all the reference points have changed. And even the city itself is almost like defamiliarized, East and West, and this is a city also that basically was understandably, given everything, bombed into rubble. The Germans described 1945 in Berlin, which was the headquarters of the Third Reich, as Jahr Null, year zero, year nothing. I mean, there was nothing left of the city. So at the same time that you're walking around and there's all of this new construction, especially since the fall of the wall, you feel like you are stepping on a kind of historically saturated land. I mean, I suppose you could argue that for any place, but Berlin, to me, is particularly rife with historical and hence imaginative possibilities for me. And so to me, politics and geography are inextricably linked, probably not surprising given that I come from Cuba. But none of my characters escapes having to contend with the politics and the historical moment that they're living in Berlin, all the while flailing about in the usual human ways we all flail about daily, and that John was talking about for his 18th century setting. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, and I felt like I learned so much about Berlin, and it just seemed like a very cool place too, where just people could go and become new versions of themselves. And there was, I like what you said about historical possibilities too. There seemed to be a lot of intersections of different cultures, and I've never been to Berlin, and I feel like I've experienced it in 2000 now.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, we got to bring it up to date now, but yes, and I wasn't in Berlin in 2000. I spent several months there in 2013, and then again just this past spring, 2023. But I was also, even though it was not that long in the past, it was a very different city in 2000, in 1989, and after the fall of the wall, etc. And so to sort of chronicle those radical changes and come to a juncture where you're assessing it, but also looking to the future was a sort of fascinating political, historical, and personal for my character crossroads. And it was kind of irresistible, honestly.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Ursula, I'm especially interested to hear your perspective on how your relationship changes as you write the book set in Bolivia, because there's the idea that time has passed. You're writing from the future, and there's also you talked a little bit about you're having to kind of make your memories more robust by jogging them with photos and filling in details. As you wrote your book, did your relationship shift with your time in Bolivia or with Bolivia in general? Did you When you sat down to write the book, did you feel the same way as when you finished writing the book about Bolivia?
Well, no, I mean that's why I wrote the book, to understand my experience, because I knew that I had had a different experience than the other volunteers. Of course, there was an overlap in our experience, but I knew that because I am Native and I was working with Indigenous people, I was having an experience that was different. And so I wrote the book to understand it and to kind of process that experience. So it did change my relationship. But when we were talking, I was thinking about some research that I was doing. It's always important to me when I'm writing about a place to understand what the indigenous populations have said, like stories that relate to that specific place. And when I was researching the book, I found some really interesting Aymara stories. And in chapter 2, I talk about an Aymara story about Salar de Uyuni, which is this large salt flat, and how the mountains surrounding it were, the Aymara say they were giants, and one giant left his wife while she was breastfeeding their child, and the wife started crying, and it mixed with the breast milk, and that's why there's this expanse of whiteness. And I loved that because it reminded me of how I think of mountains as living beings, as not as inanimate objects. And that really gave me permission to describe Bolivia in a way that reflected that because that's how I saw many of the mountains in Bolivia. So I really would recommend that folks, when you're writing about a place, look at the stories that the indigenous populations have told about that place, because they will open up a new perspective on it for you.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I remember reading that section, and that was just so powerful. It was a powerful image. It was really amazing. I'm glad you found that and shared that. And that's a perfect segue.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
was
go
just going
ahead.
to throw something in. I think I love that suggestion, Ursula. I also might recommend reading the poets of your place, no matter how far flung, because to me, they're the ones, almost more than anyone, who distill the culture sensorially, intimately, even if they're, no matter kind of the perspective of the poem. I think the poets for me are the cultural guardians of place as well.
Yes, I love that. And I loved the Lorca in your book. That was beautifully woven throughout. Um, those are great tips. I love that. Um, and perfect segues into my next question about, there's all of this information about all the different places. There's the history, there's the facts, there's what the poets have said, there's the indigenous stories. There's kind of an endless sea of information out there. And but then there's the scope and the lens of the story you're trying to tell. So I wonder if you all could kind of speak to that filtering process, how that works for, or how if you think of it even that way, as you're filtering the setting through a scope or a lens, or how you kind of winnow down the mass sea of facts there are to be found about a place. And we'll start with you, John.
Well, I think I always try to make a distinction between what I need to know to write about a place and what the reader needs to know, or what I need the sorry, I'm kind of dealing with a cold, so I'm constantly reaching for Kleenex. Because I never try to describe a place where I'm covering each and every available detail for the reader, where I'm painting a picture for that. I tend to think more in terms of what I want the reader to feel about a place. But in order to understand that or get to that point in the writing, I really have to research the place itself, so I know more than the reader needs to know in what I'm writing. So I think that's really kind of the balance I try to come to, is to figure out what are the questions that I want to answer, what are the places, what are the things that I feel like I need to know to be able to understand how the characters inhabit a scene, and then to decide, okay, what does the reader need to know to be able to have that feeling, to feel what the characters are feeling as they're inhabiting that scene. And this I think may address some of the questions that had popped up in the chat about using setting as a character. I think setting is something that often gets underutilized in stories. When we're writing a setting, it's more than just the static backdrop. I mean, sometimes it is, if you've got, black box theater where you just have two chairs and actors and the dialogue. But often when writing prose narrative, setting can help us to understand characters better. Setting can help us to understand the tone of the story. Setting can provide obstacles for the plot. So the more you can integrate the setting into the story itself and into the character development, the more setting starts to come alive. And so the story that you're writing is not just a generic story that you've decided to plop down in a particular city, but the story itself is so tightly interwoven with the setting that that story could really not take place anywhere else. So I sort of use that as my guide for, if I'm giving details just because I find them interesting, or just because I feel like, well, the reader needs to know that the house is blue. If that really plays no role in the story, it doesn't tell us anything about the characters, it doesn't advance the plot, it doesn't give us a sense of place, then I really question whether or not that detail needs to be in the setting I'm creating.
That's a really great productive process. What do I need to know versus what the reader needs to know, and is it integral to the story? Thank you. Christina, what about you? How do you think about all the facts there are to know about a place versus the scope and lens of the story?
Right. I think it's, for me anyway, very key to find the right voices, the right narratives. Usually, as I said earlier, I do multi-voiced, almost competing narratives. And so, and sometimes I know who they are ahead of time, and other times they just emerge from the history of place. I read about something odd, like the way the alligators escaped the Berlin Zoo. during a particular bombing and scared all the housewives, in Lutzvoplatz, so someone coming out of that, like some specific almost lacuna in history, almost forgotten, part of history, that they emerge and suddenly they're full of more of these kinds of stories, right? But I think it's the voice, and it's and in a way, the voice and the voices of our characters are the guides to place. They emerge from place, but they're also our guides, and their focal points and their obsessions become our focal points and our obsessions. And so I think probably that's the most important decision to make. And that voice will tell you about place, and the place will tell you more about the voice. As you were saying, they're inextricably woven. But I think voice is everything, and they will choose as they go along. I mean, you can help winnow, of course, as you were describing, but if you get the right voice, you'll have the best guide to the tale and to the place you're describing.
Oh, well said. Yeah. And I love this symbiotic relationship between the voice and the place. They reveal more of each other. I love that. Thank you so much. Ursula, what about you? How do you think about filtering all of the facts through the lens of the story?
Well, I know for me, it's something that has to come during the revision stage. When I'm first starting out writing about a place, I do try and include as many details, knowing that I will eventually decide what works or what fits the story and what doesn't. And that's also where I think about what other people have written about a place. And and I think of a time when I was trying to write an essay about Barton Springs, and so much has been written about Barton Springs. And I went and I took down all these details about the space. But when I got back and I sat down, and I realized the thing that really stood out to me was the fence, that fence that has been put all around the springs, around the swimming pool, and the life, the people who are swimming on one side of the fence, and the people who are swimming and playing with their dogs in Barking Springs in the other place. And to me, that fence, I never would have thought that fence would have been an important detail, but it was in that revision process when I was going through all the details that I kept, that I realized that that's what I wanted to talk about. And using that fence allowed me to write about something else about what Barton Springs represents in Austin.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah. And Christina and John, I'd love to hear about you, this topic of revising and that kind of revealing to you different aspects of your story. Do you all find that you've put more details in, that you need to take things out as you revise, or are you layering more detail as you revise?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll go for it. It's both. There are times where I'm taking details out, and times I'm putting things, additional layering in, additional details. But something I always tell my students is that in revision, when you're talking about setting, I think we have a tendency to have a sort of a knee-jerk response that if you've got a page-long description of a tree, well, you better cut that down, because nobody needs a whole page of details about a tree. And that, I think, on the surface, that's true. But I think if you really love that description and you want to save it, figure out a way to make it necessary to the story. So it's not always just a matter of cutting down. I'd say most of the time it really is a matter of winnowing and filtering and kind of cutting down. But sometimes, if, like when I was writing about the woods, I obviously wanted to have a lot of tree descriptions or descriptions of the woods, or as Becca just points out, the overstory, which is, there's lots and lots and lots of descriptions of trees in that novel. If you make it matter, if it is important to the story, then it gets to stay. So I think it goes both ways when we're thinking about what does the story absolutely need. You want to cut out the details that aren't necessary for the story, But if there are, unnecessary details you want to keep, figure out a way to make them necessary for the story. Can you use them to develop a character more? Can you use them in a way that will make the reader feel a pang of grief when the tree gets cut down? Then you get to sort of salvage some beautiful writing that you really want to cling to. So I don't think you always have to murder your darlings. Sometimes you can save them if you find a way to make them work.
Yeah, don't kill your darlings if you can make a case for them.
Yes.
What about you, Christina?
Right. No, I agree with what you all have said so far. Absolutely. And I don't think there are any hard and fast rules of what goes in or what goes out. I think it really, again, just to bring up voice, it depends on voice and it depends on your character, your own obsessions, and the negotiation between, obsession and momentum. Sometimes they're connected and sometimes you need a little bit more ebb and flow over time, right? But speaking of trees, in Berlin, for example, trees are absolutely essential. I mean, all the trees of the main park in Berlin, the Central Park in Berlin, were cut down in the couple of years after the war for firewood. There was literally nothing. It was denatured, and you would see kids working together to pull out the stumps. That was what was going on there. So depending on what trees mean in your setting, you could have a whole chapter on it or more, right? So there's no hard and fast rules. I tend to overwrite initially, and then I have to go in there with a machete and trim it down, but not always. Sometimes just the opposite happens, and I go too lean, and there's a sweet spot, and that changes from book to book, character to character, and where the narration stands. So it's a very fluid, as all of you who are listening and all of us here who are writing, it's a very fluid process. You don't really get to decide ahead of time, and sometimes you're still making crucial decisions years into a book.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's good permission to have. And I love the idea of the fluidity. I wrote that down, and I know Becca put it in the chat. The negotiation between obsession and momentum is so well said. And so let's now dig into kind of research. I know all of these books were very well researched. Could you give us some research tips? Particularly how to get started, because there is a wealth of information available to us. And how do you know when to stop? How do you keep research from becoming this overwhelming thing that you don't stop doing? And we'll start with you, Christina.
Okay. Well, yeah, of course it depends on the book, but I remember my third novel, which is called Monkey Hunting, was set in colonial Cuba by and large, a place I'm not that old. I haven't been there. And it was about the Chinese laborers who had been basically bamboozled in southern China to come and work Cuba's sugarcane fields in the 1840s, 50s, and so on. And it sort of follows that path. And I just there wasn't that much information about it at that time when I was doing the research, the late 90s, early 2000s. But I did everything I could. I was just lurking at UCLA library, the stacks, and insinuating myself into study groups again at UCLA. I was living in LA at the time on Asians in the Americas, and so I ended up in the end. I kind of think of research as actually any novel really is you're just shoveling into this enormous funnel everything you can get your hands on. So I don't know if you can see like an enormous funnel, but at the bottom of the funnel is this very very narrow opening. And so all this stuff is just like this crazy brew of various details and so on. But in the end, you just get the distillation, the best, what what is absolutely essential to your tale. And what is absolutely essential to your tale could be like 10 pages on one tree or whatever, if that's what it is. But to move from essential to essential. And so for me, at some point, I have to set aside the research, trust my own, where that history has resonated most, and occasionally refer back, but mostly leave it behind me to tell the tale. Otherwise, I get too bogged down.
Mm-hmm. And Ursula, I know you're teaching a class on this very topic. So without giving too much away, tell us how you approach researching a memoir, and how you know when it's time to stop kind of mining.
Right. Yeah, because it can be a real procrastination tool that I can do instead of writing. Well, and when I realized that I was relying on research because I felt really insecure about being able to write about Bolivia, but also about colonialism and the Peace Corps. And I felt like, well, I've got to get these encyclopedias and these books that really back up everything that I am saying. And I didn't realize till I was further along in the process that although that was helpful, at a point I kind of didn't need to spend any more time on it. So what I do now is I have specific topics that I'm trying to research, or that I am researching. But I have to say today, Tuesday evening is for research, but Thursday will be for writing. I simply have to set that time. I have a Pomodoro timer on my phone, and I just simply have to limit my time because I know that I love the research, and especially early in the process when I'm just not even sure what direction the work is going to go. I do have to just put a time limit on it, because otherwise, yeah, I would research and research thinking, oh, it's going to make me feel more confident about writing this topic, and it doesn't really.
Yeah, you want to be an authority on the topic, and you could research forever and not feel that way. That's really practical about, specific days being research days and specific days being writing days. I think that's really, I'm going to do that. And John, I want to know how many fires you've started and watched burn.
Yeah, I get
For
asked that
research
quite a bit.
purposes.
Yeah. It's a good thing I wasn't writing about serial killers, or I'm not sure what people would ask me about my research there. I actually I read a lot of books about forest fires, especially and if you remember Norman Maclean, he wrote A River Runs Through It, and he also has a book called Young Men and Fire, which was about fire jumpers fighting forest fires. And I was really I was writing less for facts about fire than I was reading to find out how other people have written about fire. Especially because I didn't want to stumble into cliches. If there are these sort of well-worn cliches of, flames dancing over branches, I certainly didn't want to do that again. So I read a lot of books by people who were both fiction and nonfiction that just had descriptions of fire in them, especially to find out details of things that I wouldn't have ordinarily thought about. Like, this sounds very obvious, but McLean did a very amazing job of describing the animals who were fleeing forest fires, or who were caught by the fire, and what they looked like, and the horrible, ends that they came to. And I think that's something we might not automatically think about. So I made sure I incorporated some of that into the story. So I think it's, there's the research you do when you have a question that you want an answer to. But there's also a kind of research where you don't know what you're looking for, but you're staying open to possibilities. I liked what Cristina had said about the lacunae when you're doing when you're doing research. If you're doing academic research, that's usually a cause for panic, where you're looking for information and it's not there. But when you're writing fiction, I think the blank spaces is where fiction gets to breathe. So when you're doing research and you find places where you can find the information that you want, or you don't find the documentation that you want, that's where you get to step in with your fiction, and using the facts that you do have, you get to imagine what you think a particular setting looked like or how it felt to be there at the time. And in writing about Thoreau, my initial thinking was that he was such a detailed journalist, journaling in the famous journals of Henry David Thoreau that he kept for years. The period during the fire, there's like an 8-year blank where he just stopped
Oh, wow.
writing in his journal. And my first response was, oh man, like I thought I was going to get these descriptions I could use. And then I realized that was perfect. That was great, because there was a blank slate that I could enter into and try to imagine my way into his head and what he may have thought at the time. So I think you really have to be open to a lot of different possibilities when you're researching, and not necessarily look for specific things, but remain open to the possibilities that you're going to find as you're researching.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, I was shocked when I read that in the book, that there was he didn't write about it for so many years, and then he wrote a long account.
Yeah.
But I like that you saw that as an opportunity for you to then fill in the blank. And so I have one more question before we're going to move to Q&A. We've got a ton of Q&A questions. So all of you are brilliant teachers, as well as writers. So when you're teaching your students, how do you encourage them to think about setting? Or when you're reading someone else's work, what are the elements you're looking for to signal that a setting is fully realized? And we'll start with you, Ursula.
Well, I really encourage my students to look at how setting is working in the essays that we're reading in class, or memoirs that they've read. What are the details that stand out? What are the vivid scenes that stand out to them, that really move the story forward? And where are they maybe kind of bored and skipping over? And just to examine what is working and what isn't working. And then also to think about how those descriptions of the setting help you understand the narrator, or whoever it's the narrator, better. And because I think that sometimes, especially when people are just starting out, they will include too many of those details, and details that don't necessarily tell you anything about how that person saw it. They're just kind of generic details about a blue house, or whatever. And that we want setting description that is going to tell us something about that narrator. So that's what I try and tell my students.
Marrying that voice and setting. What about you, Christina?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think of setting, or what we learn of setting, as an extension of character. A character on its own terms being the setting, but also as we're moving through this world with a particular narrator, what they notice, what matters to them, what resonates. And so that is what makes a place come alive, rather than exhaustive details. It's the selection of details, I think, that illuminate the perspective of who's telling us. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Ursula.
And John, what about you? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what was said. I mean, I always tell my students, make sure that the setting, make your setting do something. It should do something in the story. And I like to use examples like, the opening of Tolkien's The Hobbit, where that starts with, what is it? In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, but it was not a nasty hole. It was a hobbit hole. And so this means comfort. So you're getting this fairly detailed description of the place where the Hobbit lives before you've even met the character, but you already know something about the character. And not only that, but you've got plot elements because you know that this is all about comfort and, a nice place to live. So you know that when some, dwarves show up and say, "Hey, let's go fight a dragon," his response is probably going to be, "No, I want to stay in my hole." So that kind of opening, you can begin with this sort of lengthy description of setting if it's contributing to us understanding character or understanding where the plot's going to go, or something like the way Toni Morrison opens Beloved with 124 was spiteful. We've got this description of what's essentially kind of a haunted house, but we're learning something about character, we're learning about place, and we know that the story that we're coming into is going to be a very dark story.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much. So let's move to our Q&A. This first question is for you, Ursula. The memoir in Indian among los Indígenas sounds inspiring. Regarding changing the name of the place and making other adjustments, how much can an author change in a memoir? Are there regulations or recommendations?
Well, there are not necessarily regulations but I think that as you're working through the piece, your work, your memoir, you'll have a better idea of what you do and don't want to share. But just in terms of legally, I mean, once you're working with a publisher, they will read your manuscript, and if they've decided to publish it, they will be able to guide you on if you're crossing any lines that they are concerned about. I mean, those were conversations that I had with my editor and deciding what I could share and what I couldn't share. But yes, it's something that's part of the process. I would say as you're starting to write your memoir, don't worry about that so much at the beginning. Just worry about writing it. That's something that comes in later parts of the revision when you're really polishing it up and thinking about how it will be published.
Great advice. Yeah, don't self-censor too early in the process. And so this next question, my novel set in colonial Philadelphia largely takes place in a tavern owned by my, I'm not sure how to say that, Huguenot ancestors. About 80% of the way through the story, it is shuttered. I'm approaching the chapter in which that occurs. Any tips on first making a location into a character that will be missed and then writing about the death of that location? John, do you have any thoughts about this since you are a historical novelist?
Yeah, that's a very specific question. I think the way to feel that place be missed is to make to try to invite your readers in and make them enjoy being there. Show us how this is a setting where the characters who are, say, the owners of the place are, feel protective of it, and it means something to them. There's a sense of, say, family, if this has been passed down through generations, if there are people who come there seeking shelter, or you can think. I think it always helps to work through character, so to think about, no one's going to miss the tavern because the walls are beautifully painted, right? They're going to miss the tavern because characters miss the tavern when it goes down. So when it burns down or is destroyed. So I would think about the ways you can really work on solidifying the relationship between the characters and that particular tavern that they inhabit, and how meaningful it is to them, so that then by association, we as readers will also, feel that loss. I guess a good example of this would be what in all the light we cannot see, what Anthony Doerr does about the destruction of the town, where this town is described as beautiful, but we know that the Allied bombs are going to completely destroy it. And I remember reading that and feeling this great sense of loss in the way that these people who lived in this town and loved this town were about to lose their town.
Yes. Yeah, I think looking to examples is a great move. Um, and that's a beautiful one. So these next two questions seem pretty similar. When writing about a completely fictional setting, which of the five senses are most critical to use to bring it to life? And the next question is, what do you think is the most important aspect in bringing a setting to life, regardless of genre? Do you all have a favorite sense that you are always, you think is very important to evoke a setting? Christina?
It's an interesting question. Makes you think of, Madeline and Proust at the espresso and Cuban households and whatever. I think it really depends on your characters and where they are and what matters to them, what comes into play. I personally love scent, and I often don't go too many pages without scent, but also the oral is really interesting. Ambient, oral, even the quality of silences is interesting to me. I don't know. I think the maybe the more for me salient question is, how does this description seduce? How are you seducing the reader with every sentence, essentially? And it doesn't have to be beautiful necessarily, although, when that works, it's great. But how are you seducing them further into this tale, almost inextricably? We all have a million other things we could be doing, competing for our time. So why this? So I think it's whatever sense or combination of senses you're using or descriptive powers, don't forget it's seduction.
I love that. Yes, a seduction. And so this next question is basically asking, at what point do you need to book a ticket to the place you're writing about? Have you all encountered a scenario in which looking online or reading the books just wasn't doing it for you and you had to go there? Christina, I'll ask you again, since you have so many different locations in your books. Have you gone to each location you've written about?
Well, I was a journalist for 10 years before I started writing fiction. So I think it comes pretty naturally to me to get on a plane and parachute in and try and get the who, what, wheres of a place. But there was one place, and so I mostly have done that. Of course, I couldn't go back to colonial Cuba or other things like that. But the one place I couldn't go to, and this is for my fourth novel, Handbook to Love, part of it takes place in Tehran, in Iran, and I could not get there. I couldn't get a visa no matter what, and I think I made the mistake of putting down that I was writer/journalist. This would have been in the early 2000s, after 9/11, etc. And I could have said anything. I could have said shop clerk or waiter or whatever. Then what are you doing here? But I couldn't get the visa, and so I had to rely on what I read, and mostly on poets. On the poets of place. It wasn't the super major part of the book, but I love getting those small details. Right.
Ursula, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, no, for me, it was so important to go back to Bolivia. I mean, I had been back a few times and I'd stayed in touch with people, but for me, it was important. And it's funny because when I went back, I think I went back in 2018, and there were things that I had totally forgotten about, just like the challenge of communicating all day in Spanish and Quechua with people, and how I would get things wrong all the time, and just how that contributed to maybe a sense of isolation that I write about in the book. And so I would just encourage you, if you can at all. I know that for me, it helps, and there's not even even without an agenda, because I went with a specific agenda. I want to see this and eat this and do this. But that kind of flew out the window when I got there, and I was just experiencing it.
Mhm. And John, what about you?
I think it's really helpful for getting that sense of place, but certainly not necessary. With Woodsburner, I had lived in Boston for several years, and I'd been to Concord, but I'd never been to Walden Pond, and I wrote the book without having gone to Walden Pond, which my editor was horrified by. But I hadn't actually gone to that space. But also reading historical fiction, I can't go to 1844. Concord. So you have to think about why you're going to the place and what you hope to get from that feeling. I mean, on the manuscript I just finished recently, it's partially set in Poland and Warsaw post World War II, and I've been to Poland several times. But Warsaw was completely leveled after the war. I mean, the Germans had intentionally flattened the city. So what I visited now is a facsimile of what had been there before anyway. So I think if you think about, the reasons for why you're going, it's not just for visual representation, but you're thinking about maybe, somehow absorbing the culture or the people or the sense of place. But at the same time, I don't think anyone who doesn't have the means to travel to some place that they want to write about should feel that that's going to be an impediment to their writing, that you can certainly use your imagination and use enough research to be able to recreate for a reader a particular place. Because again, if you're focused on what you want your reader to feel, that's something that's quite different from saying, I'm going to give you a documentation of exactly what this place looks like when I visit it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well said. Thank you.
I also wouldn't I would also encourage you to have conversations with the ghosts of a place. And that's different for everyone, or your characters or whatever, but no place is without history, even if your setting is the here and now. And so I would listen closely to the whisperings, that murmuring you hear in the background that you're not sure what it is, and give it space.
Yes. And I loved that you did that in your novel. Thank you all. So I've learned so much. I know our community of writers has learned so much. I really thank you all for being so generous with your time and your knowledge, and for writing such beautiful books. I really adored these books. And I really encourage everyone who's tuned in to buy them, to read them, read these authors. They're incredible authors. And thank you to everyone on the live stream and everyone here on the Zoom for spending your Thursday evening with us. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, John.
It's such a pleasure, and it's so lovely to be in conversation with all of you.
Yes, thanks. I feel like I learned a lot. Thank you.
Our listeners. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much, and have a good evening.
Yes, thanks, everyone.
Happy reading, everyone. Okay. Bye.
Bye.